Lena had been sitting at that dinner table for 11 years, and in all that time, her husband had never once asked her what she was thinking. He assumed he already knew. That was the thing about Owen Calloway. Not the real Owen, but the version people saw at charity galas and board meetings and Sunday brunches with his mother. That version of Owen believed his wife was decorative, educated enough to be presentable, quiet enough not to be a problem. She spoke when spoken to. She smiled at the right people. She wore the right dress. And when the conversation turned to business, to numbers, to the kind of talk that moved money between accounts the size of small countries, Lena would pick up her wine glass and look at the centerpiece and let her eyes go soft. That was the performance. She had been giving it for years. What Owen never knew, what he never thought to ask, was that before she married him, before she changed her last name and moved into a house with a wine cellar and a housekeeper named Doris who came on Tuesdays, Lena had spent 4 years in Seoul. She had taught English at a language institute on weekdays and spent her evenings in a tiny apartment above a dry cleaner's, learning Korean the way you only learn something when you have no one to fall back on. Not from an app, not from a tutor, from the woman at the corner stall who sold her fish cake soup and corrected her pronunciation without being asked. From the radio. From the couple who argued every night through the thin wall to her left. She got good. Better than good. Owen knew none of this. Owen had met her after she came back, after the roughness had been smoothed over by a few years of regular meals and a steady job, and the gradual return of a life that looked like what people expected. He knew she'd traveled a bit after college. He had not asked for details. Owen was not, generally speaking, a man who asked for details about things that did not affect him. So when he brought Hyun-woo Lim to the house for dinner, his new business partner, the Korean tech investor everyone in the city had been courting, Owen introduced Lena with the practiced ease of a man presenting a piece of furniture he was proud of. "My wife," he said. "Just that. No name." Lena smiled and extended her hand and said it was a pleasure, and Hyun-woo shook it politely and said something back in English, and that was the introduction. Dinner was rack of lamb. Doris had prepared it before she left. Lena served. Owen talked. The deal, as she understood it from months of half-overheard conversations and documents she was never meant to see, but sometimes found left open on the kitchen counter, was enormous. Owen's company was acquiring a manufacturing subsidiary in Incheon, cutting through labor costs, restructuring the supply chain, the usual language of men who described gutting a workforce as optimizing. Hyun-woo's firm was the bridge, the intermediary, the piece that made the whole thing legal and quiet enough to not attract attention. Lena knew the outlines. She was not supposed to know even that much. It was during the second course that Hyun-woo leaned toward Owen, set down his fork and switched languages. He did it the way people do when they're certain no one else in the room will follow. Casually, the way you lower your voice not because you're whispering, but because you simply don't need to speak up anymore. And he said, in Korean, that he needed Owen to understand something, that the arrangement they'd discussed, the one with the secondary account in Singapore, was not something he was comfortable putting in writing. That his name could not appear on anything that touched that money. That if Owen wanted this done, it needed to be structured through Lena's name, through the LLC she'd signed 2 years ago that Owen had told her was a tax thing, nothing to worry about, just sign here. Lena did not move. She kept her eyes on her plate. She picked up her fork and cut a small piece of lamb and brought it to her mouth and chewed slowly and did not look up and did not change her expression by a single degree. Owen said, in Korean, that it would not be a problem. That was the moment. That was the precise moment when something in Lena's chest went very still and very cold. The way a room goes cold when someone opens a window in winter. She had suspected, in the way you suspect something you're not ready to name yet, that the LLC had not simply been a tax thing. She had suspected that Owen's late nights and deleted emails, and the new password on his phone were not entirely about work, or not only about work. She had suspected that the woman, the one she'd seen at the Meridian Group's anniversary party, the one whose hand Owen had held a second too long during a photograph, was not simply a colleague. She had suspected a lot of things, but suspicion and knowledge are not the same. What she had now was knowledge. She set down her fork, she picked up her wine glass, she looked at the centerpiece, white peonies in a low crystal vase. Doris had arranged them, and she smiled the soft, empty smile she had spent 11 years perfecting. Owen glanced at her, saw exactly what he expected to see, looked away. She said nothing. That was the night she decided she was done being underestimated. She simply decided not to announce it yet. The LLC was called Meridian Consulting Group, LLC, which she had thought was a strange coincidence when she first saw the name on the paperwork, given the party where she'd first noticed the woman. It stopped being a coincidence approximately 3 weeks after the dinner, when Lena sat in the office of an attorney named Carol Finch and spread across the desk every document she had quietly photographed, printed, or preserved over the course of the previous 4 months. She had not done it dramatically. There was no montage, no music, no late nights fueled by righteous anger. She had done it the way she had learned Korean, methodically, without anyone watching, building something solid while the people around her assumed she was simply filling time. Carol Finch was a small woman in her early 60s, with reading glasses on a chain and a reputation in the city's legal community that made opposing attorneys visibly uncomfortable. She had been recommended by a friend of a friend, someone Lena had been careful to contact through a personal email account Owen did not know existed, from a phone she had purchased with cash at a Target 30 miles outside the city. Carol looked at the documents for a long time. She asked a few questions. She confirmed the Korean conversation at the dinner, and then she set her glasses down and said, very carefully, "You understand what you have here." It wasn't a question. Lena said she understood. What she had was this: her name, her signature, on a corporate entity that had received and disbursed approximately $2.3 million over 18 months. She had not known about any of it. The money had moved through accounts she had no access to, managed entirely by Owen through a financial advisor she had met once, at a holiday party, and who had shaken her hand and said it was lovely to finally meet her. The LLC had been used to obscure the origin of funds related to the Incheon acquisition. Funds that, if properly traced, would complicate the acquisition in ways that would interest not just Owen's board of directors, but potentially federal regulators. She had also, and this was the part Carol lingered on, recorded the dinner conversation. It was not, Carol explained, legal in every state to record a conversation without all parties' consent. It was, however, legal in the state where they were sitting, and what Lena had captured, clearly and completely, on the voice recorder she had placed in her purse before Hyun-woo arrived, was Owen's explicit agreement to route money through his wife's name without her knowledge. Carol said, "I want you to understand something before we go further. Once we move, we move. There is no version of this where Owen doesn't know you've been planning." Lena nodded. "I know. Is there anything you still need to do before we file?" She thought about it. Thought about the house, the joint accounts, the investment portfolio. Owen had spent years carefully not titling in both their names. Thought about the deed to the house in Connecticut that he'd purchased 6 months ago. The one she'd found referenced in a cable bill forwarded to their home address, for a property she had never been to, in a name that matched the initials she'd found in 3 separate emails before Owen changed his password. "Give me 60 days, she said. Carol looked at her over the reading glasses. 60 days is a long time. "I know," Lena said. "That's why I want it." She did not behave differently at home. That was the hardest part. Not the research, not the documentation, not even the silent management of her own grief, which she processed in 30-minute windows in the car in the parking garage of the Whole Foods 3 blocks from their house, where she would sit with the engine running and let herself feel it and then drive home and make dinner. The grief was real. She wanted to be honest with herself about that. She had loved Owen. Not the Owen who had sat across from Hyun-woo and agreed to use her name as a financial shell. Not the Owen who had a second house in Connecticut and a woman whose initials were KH, and who appeared in his calendar as Project Debrief. But the Owen she had believed she was marrying. The one who had proposed on a Tuesday, not a special occasion, just because he said he'd realized he didn't want to wait for the right moment. That Owen she had loved genuinely. She grieved him in that parking garage. She let herself. And then she went home and made dinner and asked Owen how his day was, and listened to him talk about himself for 40 minutes, and cleared the plates and went to bed. Meanwhile, she built the case. She learned, through Carol's office, that the Connecticut property was titled solely in Owen's name, and had been purchased 8 months ago. 2 months before the LLC documents had been revised, to add a provision that would complicate any asset division in the event of divorce. That revision, which she would not have known to look for if Carol hadn't pointed to it, had been made by the same attorney who had drawn up their prenuptial agreement 11 years earlier, an attorney Owen had introduced as our guy when they were engaged, whom Lena had understood to represent them jointly, and who she now understood had represented Owen's interests exclusively. She photographed the Connecticut property listing. She photographed the calendar entries. She photographed 3 years of financial statements from the LLC account, obtained through a process Carol declined to explain in detail. She photographed emails, Not from Owen's private account, which she could not access, but from a work account that had been accidentally seeded to a household email address they shared for things like appliance warranties and HOA notices. 60 days became 53. She was ready. The catalyst. Because there is always a catalyst, she would tell Carol later. The moment when waiting stops being strategic and starts being something else was a Saturday morning in late October. Owen had told her he was going to a conference in Boston. She had said fine. She had kissed him on the cheek. She had watched him put his suitcase in the car. And then she had sat at the kitchen table for a long time, drinking coffee she didn't taste. And she had looked at the calendar on her phone, and she had looked at the notification she'd set up 3 weeks earlier. A Google alert, KH's full name, which Carol's paralegal had quietly confirmed for her. And she had seen that KH had checked into a restaurant in Hartford, Connecticut, tagged in a friend's social media post, 48 hours ago. Hartford was 40 minutes from the Connecticut property. She was not going to Boston. Lena set her coffee cup in the sink. She rinsed it. She dried her hands on the dish towel. She called Carol Finch and said, very calmly, I'm ready. Let's go. Carol said Monday morning. Lena said, Monday morning. What happened on Monday is a matter of legal record now, which means she can speak about it in broad terms. Carol filed. Owen was served at his office. She had asked for that specifically, not out of cruelty, but because she wanted a record of who had been in the room. The filing included the LLC documentation, the financial records, the recorded conversation from the dinner, and a separate filing with the relevant regulatory body that Carol had prepared quietly and separately and which was not, technically, Lena's doing but which Carol had noted she was obligated to pursue given what the documents revealed. The acquisition of the Inchin subsidiary did not close on schedule. Hyun-Woo Lim's involvement became part of an investigation that Lena genuinely had not orchestrated and was not responsible for, but which had emerged, inevitably, from the moment a regulator looked at the LLC documentation and followed the money. Owen's attorney, not their guy, a different one Owen apparently kept on retainer for reasons that were now self-evident, called Lena's phone directly 3 hours after the filing. She let it go to voicemail. She listened to the message once, deleted it, and called Carol. Owen himself called at 6:17 in the evening. She answered. He said her name. He said it the way he hadn't said it in years, like it meant something, like she was a person and not a fixture. He said he needed her to understand that things had gotten complicated, and that he had made mistakes, and that he needed her to talk to her attorney about pulling the regulatory filing, because it was going to affect a lot of people, not just him. She let him finish. Then she said very quietly, I heard everything at the dinner, Owen, every word. I speak Korean. The silence on the line was the longest she had ever heard from him. Owen Calloway was not a man who was silent. He filled rooms with his voice, his certainty, his complete and unexamined confidence that the world organized itself around his preferences. He was silent for 11 seconds. She counted. Then he said, You never told me that. No, she said, I didn't. She ended the call. She put her phone face down on the table. She sat for a moment in the kitchen that had been hers and was still hers, technically, pending resolution. And she looked at the white peonies she'd put in the crystal vase on the counter. Doris had shown her how to arrange them, years ago. And she thought about the parking garage and the 30-minute windows, and the woman at the corner stall in Seoul who had corrected her pronunciation without being asked. She thought, I learned things when no one was watching. That's the only time learning is real. The settlement took 8 months. That is a long time to live inside the machinery of ending something. And she will not pretend it was clean or quiet, or that she moved through it with unbroken composure. There were nights that were very hard. There were mornings when getting up felt like a physical negotiation. She wasn't sure she'd win, but there were also the facts, which remained facts regardless of how she felt about them on any given morning. The house went to her. The primary residence, which they had owned jointly despite Owen's best efforts, because he had refinanced in both their names 4 years prior, and that particular maneuver could not be undone. The Connecticut property was subject to separate proceedings. The LLC, which had been opened in her name without her knowledge or consent, was dissolved, and the liability for its activities was established as Owen's on the strength of the recording and the financial documentation. Carol was very good at her job. She kept her name. She had considered going back to her maiden name but decided against it, not for sentimental reasons, but because she had built things under this name. Professional relationships, a consulting practice she had started quietly 18 months before she filed, and she was not going to cede those things to the narrative that she was dismantling her life. She was not dismantling anything. She was completing a renovation she had started the night of the dinner. When Owen and Hyun-woo had spoken freely in a language they assumed surrounded them like a private wall. The consulting practice, by the time the settlement was finalized, had 4 clients. One of them was a Korean-American nonprofit she had found through a contact from her soul years. The work was not glamorous. It was exactly what she had trained for. She moved to a smaller house. Smaller by the standards of the one she'd left. Which is to say still substantial, still hers, with a kitchen she immediately began using in ways Doris never would have allowed. She set up her office in the room that would have been a guest bedroom. She put her desk by the window. She bought herself flowers, not peonies, something smaller and simpler. She did not miss the performance. That surprised her, the completeness of not missing it. She had expected to feel the absence of that version of herself like a phantom limb. Instead she felt what she could only describe as spaciousness. Room she had not known she'd been compressing herself to create. People who learned the story, the parts of it that became known, which were enough, tended to ask the same question. Why didn't you say something that night? At the dinner, when you heard them? It was a fair question. The impulse would have been obvious. To look up from the centerpiece, to set down the wine glass, to say, in perfect and unhurried Korean, I understand what you just said. The look on their faces would have been something. She had thought about it. In the moment, she had genuinely considered it. But the thing about revealing what you know is that you lose the advantage the second you do it. Owen in that moment would have pivoted. Would have reframed, minimized, apologized, attacked. He was very good at all of those things. She had watched him do them to other people for 11 years and she had, in the early years, seen him do a version of them to her, and believed the reframing because she had wanted to. She was not interested in giving him the opportunity to reframe. What she wanted was the full picture. She wanted to know how far it went, before she decided what to do about it. And that meant sitting with the knowledge in silence, across the dinner table, while Owen refilled Hyun-woo's wine glass, and talked about Q4 projections, and Lena looked at the peonies and let herself understand, completely and without flinching, exactly who she had married. Some things, once you understand them, cannot be understood. That's not a tragedy. That's just how clarity works. She understood, and she waited, and she built something in the silence that Owen never saw coming, because he had never thought to look. He had sat across from her for 11 years, and he had never once asked what she was thinking. That, in the end, was his most expensive mistake.